We went to numbers round 2.
Oh, 11. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the regularly scheduled meeting of Ways and Means Committee, and I'm joined by committee members Yang, Palmisano, Council Vice President Glidden, Councilmember Bender. And we're a quorum of the Ways and Means Committee, and we'll be joined by other council members in the next, 15 minutes or so as we prepare for the big conversation later, which will be the overview of the proposed budget for 2018. But before that, we're going to see if we can get through some Ways and Means regular items. So it's a rather extensive agenda. So we'll see if we can get through the consent agenda quickly, and then we'll move to our two discussion items. The first two items on the consent agenda are legal settlements, as well as, item number 3 is also a legal settlement. Item number 4 is a acceptance of a low bid for the Convention Center for ballroom lighting replacement project. We also have a acceptance of a low bid at the Convention Center for dock door replacement project. We have a contract amendment with TSE for community-based employment services, a contract with Gartner for research and advisory services, a contract amendment with HLP for Camelson pet licensing application. We also have a contract amendment with Perkins & Will for the pre-design and program development services for the new downtown office building project. Item number 10 is a bond issuance for the Park Board Disease Tree Program. Item 11 is a contract amendment for Driver's Alert for administering a Driver's Alert program. Contract for questions and solutions engineering for commissioning services for the Consolidated Office Building Project. Item number 13 is a grant application to the Metropolitan Council Environmental Services for municipal infiltration inflow reduction. Item 14 is the employment settlement agreement for Janae Harto, and that includes the payment as well as COBRA benefits. This is coming from us from the Executive Committee and will be discussed in greater detail at the Committee of the Whole and or the Council meeting on Friday. Item number 15 is the contract amendment with Riverview Window Inc. for lead remediation services. Item 16 is the Northern Metals Consent Decree Advisory Committee that establishes that special advisory committee. Item number 17 is an agreement with Level Brand LLC for public service announcement production and placement. Item 18 is a contract amendment for a municipal building for installation of 3 vaults. 19 is a contract with HDR for corrosion control program services. We also have a contract amendment with Heitkamp for cleaning and lining of cast iron water mains. 21 is a Central Avenue, 18th Avenue Northeast traffic signal upgrade, pedestrian improvements project. 22 is the 7th Street traffic signals and pedestrian improvement project. Item number 23 is 4th Street Southeast street reconstruction project. 46th Avenue South street reconstruction project is item number 24. Item number 25 is the 2017 alley renovation program. Removes one of the alleys from that program. Item number 26 is Lynn Lake Municipal Parking Lot. This is setting 2017-2018 impact fees. Item number 27 is the grant from Minnesota Department of Public Safety, Office of Traffic Safety for traffic enforcement support. 28, the grant from Minnesota Department of Public Safety for the traffic safety for a DWI enforcement officer. Item number 29 is the grant from State of Minnesota 4th Judicial District Court for Police Liaison DWI Defendant Monitoring Services. And the final item on the consent agenda, item number 30, is the Minnesota Board of Firefighter Training Education Training Reimbursement Redistribution. Are there any questions from committee members on items 1 through 30? Not seeing any. All those in favor of those items, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Those items all carry forward for the council meeting. Our final 2 items are discussion items, and I think we're going to begin with the, this is item number 31 on the agenda. It's a response to the staff direction regarding participatory budgeting. Welcome.
Chair Quincy, council members, happy to be here today to give you a brief update on participatory budgeting and the staff directive that the council adopted on December 7th, 2016 as part of the budget process. So we've had some opportunities to learn more about participatory budgeting, which is another way to engage the public in the process. Just a little bit of background on what we already do. The city has several opportunities for engagement. We have 3 budget hearings. State law requires 1, so we have 2 more than state law. BET has 1 and the city council has 2. We also have CLIC, which is the Capital Long Range Improvement Committee, an appointed committee that provides recommendations to the mayor. In addition, grants and special projects may also have participation on various items. The research that we've done, we had Maria Haddon from the Participatory Budgeting Project come to give us some information because participatory budgeting means different things to different groups. That was a larger group. We then decided we needed to work with a smaller group. We developed a staff exploratory work group consisting of Nuria Riviere Vandermeid from the City Coordinator's Office, Casey Carl from the City Clerk's Office, David Rupador from NCR, Micah Intermill, and myself. We also engaged Joyce Stevens for discussion about whether recast should be our pilot project and determined that for timing and other reasons it was not a good fit at this time. We also met with communications staff because part of this is getting that communication out to the public. We also met with the engagement design team as part of the process and reviewed what other cities do for participatory budgeting. We looked at many cities. There are about 7 of the 50 largest cities in the United States who use participatory budgeting. And what we've learned so far is that it means different things to different cities. There are definitely different amounts that cities apply and different time frames. So it can be done in different ways in various cities, from engaging the public to present projects to just providing input. It's very labor intensive. It takes a lot of time both to design, and designing properly is critical, and it takes a lot of time for the process. Additionally, usually a staff person is added to see the process through. The design timing itself generally takes 3 to 6 months, and the process generally from 6 to 10 months. And what we felt for the city is that it should meet both the city's community engagement goals and the city's complex budget process. And to be successful, it needs to be supported by staff and elected officials. Therefore, it's very important that we design it properly and that the council and elected officials have time to review it and commit to that process. So based on those pieces that we've learned, plus some of the case studies that have gone through, what we are proposing is that we develop a playbook of sorts that we can use when needed, when it would benefit the process to have more participatory budgeting. This would provide a uniform, consistent process with known expectations on both sides. Part of it would also provide some transparency and integrity, which are critical to the process. So again, it would give council flexibility and allow you to use the participatory budgeting process when it would fit for the project, could quickly be implemented, and again, it helps to manage expectations for all of the stakeholders. The community that's being engaged will know what their role is and what they can expect on the back end. So the next steps that we have upcoming are to once again engage Maria Hayden with the participatory budgeting process project to help us design the process. That will involve some on-site meetings with various staff and officials perhaps, and a full vetting of what that process will be before it comes to council, hopefully for adoption in December. At that point, we could then come up with a pilot project for 2018 and use that to refine our process as the council determines whether or not this becomes an annual process or more than an annual process, and it is used for individual projects along the way. So again, we as staff are going to go back and work with Maria Haddon of the participatory budgeting process to develop a playbook, essentially a guideline of all of the parts of the process, and bring that back to you for approval in December. With that, any questions I would happily take, and also to thank the members of the committee who assisted on the project.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from staff on this update as we look forward to the playbook coming up in December?
Thank you.
Thank you. Council Vice President.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to say thank you to our staff for this report and for, taking the time, I think, to try to have a good process, reaching out to policymakers as well as engaging affected staff, because in the end, this is a big fundamental change in terms of thinking. And so we want to make sure that we have a good process that can be supported for moving forward. So while I think in some ways, personally being a fan of this, I have some anxiousness. I'd like to see it applied. I also know that making sure we do it right will be a better course to making sure that it's something that can be embraced and supported, and hopefully have a sustainable place within our budgeting process. So I just wanted to say I think you're doing a good job. I do think that the contract will help flesh this out in a way that's kind of hard to see right now with what a process might look like. And so thank you for leading the work.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good. I'm sorry. There's a question from Councilmember Bender.
Thank you. And this may be something that comes back through the presentation in December, but I just wanted to highlight one challenge that I've seen as we try to dip our toe into any version of participatory budgeting, and that's a desire for policymakers to make changes to what's being proposed through whatever process was used. And I wondered if you've seen through examples from other cities or even from the examples that we've tried here, is that typical for council members to change what comes out of a participatory budgeting process? Or how do cities manage to have a process that ends where kind of everyone feels confident that the process reflected community desires? We all know that our communities that we represent, and of course across the city, are diverse and have a lot of perspectives. So it seems like sort of the biggest fundamental challenge in participatory budgeting is how do you ensure that you've set up a process that everyone feels confident in and feels like if they're going to take the time to volunteer or participate as a citizen or vote, that they feel like their voice is heard at the end.
Right. And Councilmember Bender, committee members, you're absolutely right. That is critical because this could do more harm than good if you don't follow through with that process. That's why taking the time to design the participatory budgeting process up front is critical so that everyone does understand those expectations, that the elected officials go in knowing that this is what the guidelines are and that they are all in favor of adhering to those. And yes, there have been issues. That is one of the downfalls that the participatory budgeting organization cites as a problem if the council does not follow through, because you're asking the public to speak, and if you don't follow through with that, you're not honoring that commitment. So it's critical, and we will address that as we design the process to make sure that council members who have concerns can speak to those, and we have transparency and really are careful about setting those expectations so that the council feels comfortable that the means we've gotten to at the end will allow them to follow through. So if it's a voting process and you're going to commit to that, or if it's just input, we need to design something that makes you comfortable that you can follow through with that commitment.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. I guess that we should take an action on this. This is a receive and file that report on the staff direction on participatory budgeting. So all those in favor of that receive and file, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That moves forward. Thank you so much. I also neglected to mention as we began, we've been joined by Councilmember Johnson, a member of this committee. We've also have the presence of Councilmembers Cano, Goodman, and Reich. I think you guys are probably here for this next discussion item. Thank you very much for being here as part of that engagement process. Mr. Ruff, for the next item, you're going to be giving an overview of the city budget and the process that will follow.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, council members, I'm Mark Ruff, the Chief Financial Officer for the city. Thank you for the opportunity to present the mayor's recommended budget for 2018. As every year, which I know you as a committee and a council take very seriously, these are big decisions that are being made over the next several months, and we see this opportunity of a presentation to take especially your questions to make sure that if we can't answer them today, that we carefully research them, pass them along to the departments so that when they make their presentations, they're clear about what all the expectations and details are. I really do want to just at this time also thank our staff who works hard all year long on the budget. Particularly want to highlight the gentleman to your left, who's Micah Innermill. He is our budget director who has been in place for less than 5 months. So when you think about learning the city's budget in just a period of a few months, I think Micah has exceeded all of our expectations and has just done a wonderful job. So I'm grateful he's joined us from the state of Minnesota. Also, certainly Lori Johnson's our CFO, who just you spoke with, was also critical. And then our budget team, who works with Micah and also with Mike Ablin, who's our capital budget director. And then also the CLIC committee, which puts a great number of hours, one of the, I think the mayor likes to refer to one of the hardest working advisory committees we have in the city in terms of all of you appointing those members of the committee. And I know you know how seriously they take that role. But certainly just Jeffrey and Gina are in the audience. Brad Honnell's not here from our budget team. But we have a good group of people working on the budget, along with all the people within each department who carefully track the budget and prepare all those presentations. So I just want to say, as still a relatively new person to the city, less than 2 years, it's just very high quality people that we have working with the city, with you and your staff. So thank you for that. Property tax levies, as council's aware, there's several categories of the property tax levy. We're going to start talking about the general fund, and because that's where the most of the property tax levy goes. But included in the city's tax levy is the park board's general levy as well as the tree levy. We as a city also have the bond redemption fund, which essentially is our debt service payments. And remember that we issue debt for not just us, but for the park board as well. So there are certainly park board projects that are supported with that money. The permanent improvement levy being money dedicated to some primarily public works projects, but because of the 20-year streets plan, there's been less need for that. We've also been able to work closely with public works and certainly Chair Reich has been involved with on TPW, refining our capital budgeting process and our accounting process so that there is more accuracy in all of those numbers. Not that we haven't been accurate in the past, but really just there's less margin for error is probably a better way to put it. Pension levies are stable. These are closed pension funds, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Board of Estimate and Taxation is up by 10,000, so that's one of the separate boards that we include in our levy. The MBC is really our amount of payments toward use of this historic city building. Teachers' retirement is years ago legislative compromise where the city still contributes to teachers, even though the city hasn't been involved in education for decades, and that number continues for a number of years. And then the library referendum debt service, which I'll talk about why that number is going up later on in the presentation. So you can see overall, all of those levies together, 5.5% increase, or $17 million in total numbers. If we step back from the levy and say, where do all of our revenues come from at this $1.4 billion budget? You can see that property taxes on the far left, the green number, about 19% of the total city budget comes from property taxes. The vast majority comes from charges for services, and that's primarily our enterprise funds. It's our utilities, sewer, water, stormwater. It's our parking, and some other charges for services, but certainly that 39%, the largest source of revenues. Just a reminder, in terms of federal government budget next year, 2%, $33 million. So I know earlier this year there were concerns about how much federal grants would be continuing, but has been and continues to be a pretty small part of that budget. We haven't adjusted that dramatically downward because of any actions this year. It's been fairly constant from year to year. Other major revenue sources we just want to highlight. Certainly sales and entertainment taxes are a big part of the city, as well as local government aid, which we actually have a little bit more this year, thanks to the governor and the legislature, than we did last year. Expenditures by major type, just general categories that you'll see in our financial statements. Just highlight one number there in terms of debt service being 11% of the total budget. Always caution policymakers that as you will start to see that number rise a little bit, but certainly like your own personal financial statements, my experience is that once that number starts getting closer to like more than 15, 20% is when you start getting concerned, and rating agencies certainly get concerned because that's considered to be a fixed cost, like pension costs. And so whereas the rest of the budget in terms of current year capital and operating expenses have more flexibility to it. But 11% is a very healthy number for a city of our size, where you'll see a chart how our debt levels have been decreasing over a long period of time. Just major functions here. You can see Public Works, again, because of this being overall budget, not just general fund. Public Works being the department that oversees those utilities. We also have Fleet that serves the city under Public Works. So that's our largest department in terms of expenditures. Police also at 13%. You can see the Park Board is not included, and at the top excludes independent boards. Certainly want to commend the Park Board. Their budget is online. I think the Park Board staff and elected officials certainly welcome questions from the public, and we have traditionally, during this period of time on questions about the Park Board budget, redirected folks directly to those staff rather than that coming through the city. But certainly the Park Board is a large part of the city operations overall within that independently elected structure. So changes from last year, overall 6.2% increase by $82.5 million. Again, that's all enterprise funds, special revenue funds, and the city's general fund. Just if we look at the general fund alone, it's $34.3 million. About half of that are change items. Down below on the change items, remember within the city's budget we have these ongoing expenses, which are essentially expenses that become more embedded year to year and have tails, we sometimes refer to them as, whereas one-time items are those that are just expected to be undertaken 1 year. Maybe some of those may be renewed, but they tend to either be pilot programs, they tend to be capital expenditures, so they don't commit the city long-term to those budgetary expenses. Out of that 11.9 million, 3.4 of that are the general fund, are reimbursements from the host committee. So that's a part of our expenditure budget, but also just knowing that there's also revenues to offset many of those expenses. And when I mean the host committee, I'm referring to the Super Bowl event in February of 2018. So going back to the general fund, about $15 million is just current service level growth or inflation on our budget, and then $2 million is fund balance for cars. That's our capital asset request system, primarily for equipment and technology improvements. Employment is projected to go up by 40, just under 41. In the budget book is a breakdown by department as to what those changes on employment are. But you can see from the employment, we again are excluding the Park Board out of this particular chart, but we are getting back to the levels of the pre-recession. Some of the hiring certainly is directly related to our capital improvements, especially the 20-year parks and streets, where the Public Works is hiring more people. That's both for not just streets, but also for utilities as we continue to fix the, especially sanitary sewer infrastructure and also water mains as we move through those street reconstructions. Just a reminder for those not familiar with how city budgets work, when I use these terms and have thrown around, general fund is the main operations of basic city services that rely on outside revenues to support them. Enterprise funds tend to be in the larger governmental accounting system self-supporting. They're more like business units, so we charge for all of these different enterprise funds and have expenses then and debt service paid only from those revenues. Special revenue funds tend to be things that are not as much basic services, but certainly important services and activities within the city's budget. So the convention center is a longstanding special revenue fund. It generates some revenue, but it is not a self-supporting enterprise. Target Center would fall into that category as well. Internal service funds, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but the council is aware that we essentially create our own services within the city and allocate those almost like internal business units, and then we will discuss capital at the end of this presentation. So the general fund, just a reminder that when we pass the, as a city, when we pass the Parks and Streets agreement with the Park Board, there was a one-time 1% levy increase associated with operating cost increases for primarily the Park Board, just about $3 million to the Park Board. That was for the 17 budget, and then a small amount for the Public Works Department related to streets. And then much of the capital was going to be funded by ongoing levy increases rather than just take that increase all in 1 year over approximately a 15-year period. And so 0.7% of the 5.5% levy is related to that Parks and Streets agreement. In other words, if we didn't have the Parks and Streets, the levy increase would be 4.8%. The mayor has highlighted a number of themes. I just want to break out the fact that in our budget, we tend not to aggregate the budget document by themes. We tend to aggregate it by departments. And so in this presentation are just some of the highlights of that theme broken down by departments. And I won't read all of these, but certainly you can see that public safety means a number of things within the city, within at least 5 different, if not more, but for this budget purposes, 5 different department increases in budgetary expenditures. Within the theme of addressing climate change, we do have a number of activities within the coordinator's office and related to franchise fees, which I'll be touching on in a minute. And also the health department, which is responsible for this energy benchmarking program and through our green business program as well. Affordable housing is primarily within our CPED, our Community Planning and Economic Development Department. There's also, though, a small component of the budget that is related to a request from the Public Housing Authority for more security dollars, and that is within this budget as well.
Mr. Ruff, excuse me if I could. Councilmember Fry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
Mr. Ruff, on the previous slide, it talks about the enterprise emphasis on public safety. It talks about the 8 additional community safety liaisons. So I've heard them referred to in 2 different ways, and they may be the same thing, but just referenced in a different dynamic. I've heard community safety liaisons. I've also heard crime prevention specialists. Are we're talking about the same thing here?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Fry, we are.
Okay, that's it.
Councilmember
And I think it was, I apologize, I think it was maybe one of our documents that referred to them in a term other than community safety liaisons, but I think that is the appropriate term.
Go ahead, please. Councilmember Fry, please. Okay. Councilmember Bender had a thought.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to clarify. So when I met with the chief earlier, it was last week, he actually made a very clear distinction between community safety liaisons and the existing program of crime prevention specialists. So I just wanted to clarify that that's what you just said, that they're 2 separate programs.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Bender, correct. Yes.
Yeah, I actually was, well.
Your previous answer made me think that you were saying that they were the same. Yeah. I just wanted to clarify that that's not what the chief told me.
Mr.
So
Chair,
I
appreciate
the
that.
chief needs.
When I say the same, I see in the context of this budget and these number of people that are being increased, the terms have been used interchangeably, inappropriately so. Okay, so the term that should be used is community safety liaisons, which is which is different from crime prevention specialists. And what the chief, as I understand the discussions from the chief, is asking for are these 8 community safety liaisons. Mr. Innermill can correct me if I'm not correct.
No, thank you for that clarification. Any further on that? Councilmember Goodman, please.
On a different topic. I'm going all the way back to slide 5, Mr. Ruff. I'm wondering where we could find a breakdown for expenditures by major functions in an actual cash amount rather than a percentage of the total budget. So, for example, what is the total budget for police? What is the total budget number for fire? I didn't see it in this packet, and I might have just been skimming through it. If it could just be sent to me, that would be great.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Goodman, we will certainly send it to you.
Thanks.
So with that, pathways is a theme also within this budget that wasn't necessarily highlighted in the mayor's address, but just one that is ongoing, and I know many of you as council members support, and that's an effort led by a number of places, including our Human Resources Department, to increase diversity within our own workforce, and certainly this budget has components for those programs as well. An area of this transparency and data practices. Certainly the clerk's office, where it's predominantly where those lie, but certainly as we talk about a new office building for the city, it's not just about public transparency, but it's also data practices. How do we have information more readily available when we get these requests in? another component of.
Excuse me, Mr. Ruff. Councilmember Connell, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to go back to the public safety slide because I was hoping that there would be more on this subject, and I didn't see anything specifically written out on the slide about addressing or reducing or eradicating commercial sexual exploitation. And I know that there's at least 2 different budgetary notes from the last budget that we approved and discussed. One was with the health department, and I know that it was slated to be an ongoing component. And then there was another piece with the city attorney's office. So I'm just curious about why that's not highlighted here, and what's going on with that.
Sure, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Kano. There is a slide later on that will describe more fully some of the public safety components, but both of those programs that you've mentioned are in the proposed budget. I think for us, there was no intention of excluding it other than we tried to take some of the larger dollar amounts that were highlighted within this budget. But if we haven't answered your question at the very end, then certainly Mr. Intermel will get you details on what those program funding amounts are within those departments.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
I think that it's fair to say, Mr. Ruff, that what you're offering here and highlights is substantive changes or enhancements to the budget. If they're ongoing projects that from previous budgets, they'd appear under what we'd consider continuing service levels, which are funded within the budget. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, you
Kind
are
of interpretation?
correct. Yes.
I hope that clarifies a little bit.
Well, maybe it's not about clarifying anything for me. It's the fact that I want it prioritized and codified publicly on the slide, because commercial sexual exploitation is one of the single most difficult challenges when it comes to crime and safety issues in the 9th Ward. I'm not sure what's happening in other wards with that issue. I know that a lot of folks are anticipating an increased activity of sex trafficking because of the Super Bowl. So it was curious to me that it wasn't one of the sort of main points that we're highlighting. So I don't need clarity. I just want priority.
Mr. Chair, comment duly noted, so thank you. IT implementation certainly is an issue that as an enterprise-wide issue. We are going through rapid change in our society about how we interface with software and hardware, and our IT department does a great job on keeping the citizens' data safe on all of implementation of a wide variety of projects. But you've heard of some difficulties with the ELMS project. There's some funding to help smooth through some of those hurdles. There's also some funding for our department as we move through our own systems of financial and HR implementation. But largely, too, I think it's a broader discussion for the council in terms of there's an IT governance process going on about how we make prioritized decisions and harder decisions about software and hardware needs within the city. Cost containment and strategic cuts are certainly an element as well, and we have high growth of expenditures, which in the mayor's recommended budget is cut back on both IT and fleet. In other words, there was much greater requests than resources for our internal service, which affects our tax levy. And there's also been just under $1 million of cuts to 6 different departments as well. Last thing I want to just highlight is the council is aware that we are moving in 2018 to medical self-insurance. You will not see a great change in the budget because of that. It is a shift really primarily of really it's not the administration of the program that's changing. We are continuing with the same administrator for 2018, but it is really just then the city taking the insurance risk, much like we do in other parts of our enterprise. But I just do want to highlight we have 1 FTE for there as well. So when we look at the general fund overall, the changes that occur are highlighted in 17 to 18 and then a percentage change. Just one thing I want to mention is we are not doing away with the sales tax. Someone may look at this chart and say, why are we going from $82.3 million in revenue to 0? It's a part of the discussion that started with this council back in December on a staff direction on these downtown assets was an idea that we would shift the receipt of those sales and entertainment taxes to a special revenue fund, and that will be within a new downtown asset special revenue fund. And then money will come back on a more predictable basis to the general fund. And so if you look at transfers in, you can see that's going up substantially. So $30.6 million of that transfer in is money coming back directly to the general fund to help keep property taxes down. So I want to highlight that one particular area, and then we will talk, as I said, about franchise fees. But there are, other than that, the local government aid I referred to is just over $1 million of increase. But some of our other revenue sources, particularly license and permits, while we're having very good years on building permits continuing, we don't see huge growth. In fact, from 16 to 17, we've seen a little leveling on that resource as well. And then certainly fines and forfeits is a number that is not keeping up with inflation as well. So general fund overall, in terms of those revenue sources, just a different way graphically of looking at that same information. And then to highlight in terms of where our budget is apportioned when we think about more globally categorizing those revenues, you can see the gray in the middle is the tax levy, the property taxes, and in this particular year, 39% of the city's general fund, and then the smaller dollar amount that we're talking about, not the overall $1.4 billion budget. LGA is local government aid, which is up again slightly, but still a much smaller version than 2002, which is the bar on the far left. And there's nothing magical of 2002 other than it was before the state started making significant cuts in local government aid. So just a snapshot of how we've changed structurally for revenues for the general fund over a 15-year period. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'd like to just move into discussion about these franchise fees, because it has been a topic of conversation, and there's confusion that even we have internally about what a franchise fee is. And so I'll just take a few minutes to review that. The city has in the 18 budget $33.5 million of a franchise fee revenue source. It's broken into three main components. One is related to cable TV fees, which are not proposed to be changed. The rate is not proposed to be changed from 17 to 18. The primary changes are within the Excel electricity bill and the CenterPoint gas bill. Now, these are fees that are collected by these utilities. The city does charge on the basis of a percentage of the bill, essentially a percentage of the gross revenues of the utility. It is pursuant to a franchise-free agreement and an ordinance. And so to make changes, we first have to change the ordinance, and then according to that franchise fee agreement, there's a 90-day period, an implementation period, essentially to change the billing system for the utilities before it would take place and take effect. So if we had a full year in 2018, this 0.5% rate increase that has been proposed would be $2.9 million, but in the 2018 budget, we were not sure that we would actually get through the implementation period in time for January 1, and so we took roughly 3/4 of that amount, and so $2.2 million is what is in the 18 budget, and then it would be another increase of $700,000 in 2019 budget if it were brought forth. It was endorsed by the Clean Energy Partnership, and those not familiar with that organization, it is a cooperative effort with the city and the two large utilities that were mentioned. There is a board that meets quarterly. There is also a advisory committee that we'll talk a little bit about as well, who helps along with staff from each of the utilities in the city. There are different fee classes for this fee. So residential has a different rate, currently at 4.5% of the total bill. Commercial is higher, industrial lower, but each of those classes as proposed would get a 0.5% rate increase. So again, it's more like a sales tax. It's not like the levy where we're talking about 5.5% increase. It is a rate change, which has a different percentage increase change depending on what type of class that resides within that. The Clean Energy Partnership Advisory Board did put together a document, and these figures come from that particular document. You can see what they've demonstrated as a typical residential, commercial, and industrial, what that 0.5% means to a monthly bill. And then in terms of the total bill, then after the increase, what that amount is for each of those classes. And some selected cities, that was part of a survey that was done by the advisory group, shows for residential only how we compare to some of our neighbors. This is not comprehensive list. There are dozens and dozens of cities across the state of Minnesota that actually implemented franchise fees. Many of them charge a flat amount per month as opposed to a percentage, but this is an average of those comparable cities. So with that, Mr. Chair, if there's not any questions on franchise fees, I am, instead of taking the time for...
Councilmember Goodman.
Mr. F., what does the franchise fee pay for now? Is it a fee like any other fee and it needs to go to pay for things associated with utilities and the franchise? Or does it just go into the general fund?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Goodman, it goes into the general fund. I would say that franchise fees are only allowed because of state law allowing cities to charge this, and part of the original idea behind franchise fees was to number one, utilities not having to pay for a number of fees that they otherwise would pay for. So, for example, I think it's a part of utilities replacing some of their infrastructure. They don't pay the typical kind of permit fees and lane use fees that we see, and so there is a somewhat of a quid pro quo in this, but it is not measurable. In other words, it is not every dollar we increase the franchise fee has to be related to right-of-way improvement or such. The state law gives flexibility on the cities and the amount of franchise fees that are charged, and it is really according to the franchise agreement in terms of how the process is of the increase occurs.
Mr. Chair, so it's kind of semantics. I mean, we could have just taken a portion of the franchise fee that we were currently charging and put that towards clean energy initiatives, but that goes to the general fund, so it has to compete with everything else. So the idea is to raise the fee, and to dedicate that to clean energy work, even though we had the ability to designate any of the franchise fee in the past towards clean energy work. So it's really just a question of semantics. We could also raise the general fund levy or use existing general fund to pay for this important clean energy work.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Goodman, yes, any revenue source that I think the city has done a nice, at least coming again on a newer basis. When we don't have a state or federal rule restricting our revenues, we as a city have maintained flexibility for our revenue sources, so we do not tie them to specific expenditures, whether they're property taxes, franchise fees. The sales tax does have some state requirements, but they're again fairly loose in terms of how we use the sales taxes. So that is true.
Please continue.
So, Mr. Chair, instead of taking the time of the committee today of running through each of the line items here that are included for the change items, this category is the ongoing. The ones that I talked about are committed more long-term. Every year, of course, you as the council have the choice of changing expenditure levels for any of the city departments, but these are essentially the results of the requests that came through from whether it be you, the departments, or the mayor herself in terms of changes to the city's budget for particular programs. And so unless there are specific questions, which we may or may not be able to answer today, I'm just going to page through this and highlight, allow you to ask questions right now, but I'm not going to take a time to walk through each one of those line items if that's acceptable. And certainly the attorney, the city clerk, and the fire department are all included in this particular category. The city coordinator, as was mentioned, we have a substantial part of the clean energy partnership expenditures within the coordinator's office. I just want to highlight the fact that the mayor's budget does not detail the use of all of those increases. So it is up to the clean energy partnership to just under $1 million in terms of how we would use that money in terms of either existing programs or new programs. So there is some unallocated part of that I think the mayor was intentional about not associating with this increase in the franchise fees. There are also some expenditures here that were one-time that are being brought to an ongoing basis. So, for example, I'll talk about the $190,000 of enterprise sustainability activities, which is again was a one-time but now ongoing because of the more ongoing resource. Certainly, each of these categories don't want to diminish the importance of them, but again, we'll not highlight them for purposes of discussion today. a more full and descriptive line item of the police budget is included in this particular presentation, rather than that grouping early in the discussion.
Mr. Ruff, I'm just, as you're scrolling through these, it just occurred to me, are these ongoing expenses within the general fund, or are you highlighting any that might be just one-time expenses?
These are the ongoing. I will move to the one-time just as you speak here.
Okay.
So,
Why don't we talk about the one-time?
so the one-time expenses, again, those that are either trial or particular just short-term commitments are included in this particular grouping. One thing that I will mention, because it bears some discussion, which is the middle of this page, 125,000 specifically with greater MSP. As we know, in last year's budget, that was a reduction to the commitment to this regional economic development group. The mayor has introduced an increase back closer to the levels that were supported previously. So with that, Mr. Chair, if there's no other specific questions that council members want to highlight, just a allocation of the description of the cuts and the reallocations. The last bullet point here in terms of the public works, traffic, and parking services, the $245,000 is not a cut to expenditures in terms of personnel. I know that Councilmember Reich's committee has worked hard at the LED replacement process for our streetlights, and we are beginning to see the savings associated with lower utility costs for those streetlights. And so in the mayor's proposed budget is a reallocation of those expenses because they're just no longer needed within the Public Works Department due to that energy efficiency improvement, which will also continue in the future. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'm just going to quickly move on to property taxes because, as I said, the general fund is the one that drives the majority of the property taxes, and people are, always curious about what's the impact on me as a resident within the city. Just a different form of the graph you saw earlier in terms of where does the levy go to. And certainly the park board being at just under 20% is a substantial part of the city's levy. A few highlights here. One is the stability of our closed pension fund, at least for 2 years. The legislature didn't keep our pension aid constant. It is forecasted to go down in the next biennium, but it had been forecasted to go down in the previous biennium, and so we're optimistic, and we'll be working hard with Mr. Ranieri and the IGR area to continue demonstrate the need of what that state aid does for us in helping to reduce property taxes. Library debt service, I mentioned earlier that number is going up by $1 million. That is the result of the fact that we do have this library aid that the state has paid us now for 1 year. We'll be receiving a second check in November. That was due to legislation a few years ago that gave us additional resources. We are not having more necessarily higher debt or increasing debt service. What the state legislation was set up as that aid is a matching amount. So in other words, they give us 40% of our levy in aid. So we talked with the state and said, if we repurpose one of our capital levies, in this case $1 million, will you give us more aid? And the answer was yes. So we have $400,000 more in aid because we are levying more. What that means is we will be able to pay off those library bonds faster. And part of our discussion with the state is we will have less interest costs than both of us in terms of being able to pay off this more quickly. And so that is the basis for that increase in the levy. And as I said, that was mainly a repurposing of a capital levy that was already within the budget from last year. This is just a chart showing the levy history in terms of since 2002. A demonstration of just different types of property and value, how the values have changed. So this is a chart that encompasses both new construction and inflation on existing properties.
That change, Mr. Ruff, is that from what year? Last year to
From
this year?
2017 to 2018, correct.
And the previous slide, could you go back just a quick? Just want to point out that's the property tax levy, and that kind of reflects some of the changes we saw earlier in the decade with local government aid reductions. We have had to make up a significant portion on the property tax levy history of that, rather than having that state aid program fully performing.
Our single-family valuations are for the first time surpassed, again, that pre-recession dollar amount. Again, this is a median single-family value according to the city's assessor's office. This is the same chart that was in the mayor's letter from August 15th of 2017 for the 18 budget tax impacts by different types of property. You can see in this particular grouping under apartment and commercial, we showed, even though previously we showed the apartments going up overall by almost 15% in value, 6% of that is new construction. So this is just trying to demonstrate if you are living in an apartment and if you were on average one of those apartments, which nobody is the average, but if you were theoretically the average and you went up by 9%, this is what it does for your property tax bill if you are apartment owner, and then it's up to the apartment owner how they translate those property tax increases to rent increases. Same for commercial, in particular for commercials that are leasing out. Overall, the market value of the city, it, again, depends on how you talk about market value, but we're just close to 10% overall market value increases. New construction, again, because we have such a big tax base, people think we see all these cranes going up, and so my taxes should go down rather than go up, right? That's a logical conclusion, except for the fact that our tax base is so large that even, which this year is just under 750 million of new value added to our tax base, because we have almost $45 billion of tax base. That's less than a 2% impact. And so certainly it will help alleviate property taxes, but it does not prevent increases in property taxes. There are certainly other factors that on this chart that we talked about earlier, you'd wonder why are lower value homes going up at a rate faster than higher value homes in terms of shouldn't everything be linear? Well, we have the state program called the market value exclusions. So because you have a homestead piece of property, you pay less property taxes than somebody who's non-homestead, but as your value increases, you lose the benefit of some of that market value exclusion, which is the reason that people's lower valued homes are accelerating at a percentage higher than the higher valued homes. Other factors that we've talked about previously, fiscal disparities in tax increment in terms of some of that growth going to other places than just the general fund. Overall, what we see is 15% approximately. Again, the number is a little, these are all preliminary numbers. We haven't even received final values from the county yet to give you a 100% accuracy number, but just right around 15% of residential property is not going to see a tax increase. And that's largely because those properties are not going to see value increases. Okay, so the two are directly related.
Mr. Ruff, Councilmember Goodman.
So I just want to make sure I heard this right. 15% of residential properties will see no property tax increase.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Goodman, that is our sampling of property, yes.
So this could be written as 85% of residential properties will see a tax increase.
So the numbers that I want to highlight here is for our analysis is we exclude parcels that are under 30,000 in value.
Okay.
So if you have a condominium and you have a garage, that's a separate tax parcel, which is very common. We're excluding those. And then we are also excluding anybody who has new construction because that skews your one year to a next comparison.
So 85% of all residential property taxpayers are going to see a property tax increase.
The sampling of the data would say yes.
Well, I think it's interesting you spun it as 15% won't, but I really read that as 85% of the people will.
Mr. Chair, I'm following what has been more tradition in terms of how these numbers are presented, but certainly would accept any other version of those numbers. And this chart on the next page may give you a better sense of not just black and white, but the range of the property tax changes that will occur. So again, it's related to value increases. So this is a sample of 100,000 parcels in the city. So I would say that one of the downfalls of the sampling is if you do have that condominium building and you have a lower value unit and your garage is worth $30,000 and that doesn't change in value, then it skews some of this upwards. But in the same case, it might skew it downwards. But that's a fairly small range of people who have accessory parcels. So in other words, there's a number of people who have a residential property that have 2 or 3 parcels they're paying on.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Ruff, so given that we now know that over 50% of all of the people in the city rent apartments, where is the analysis with regard to apartments and apartment values and what we see happening in terms of, but there's no large sample of that, there's just the market value?
Again, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Goodman, there's not a direct relate. I mean, most apartment dwellers don't have a triple net lease. I mean, they don't pay their property taxes directly. So their taxes are embedded in their rents. And so how a property owner chooses, even if I own a duplex, to change my rent for my tenant in one particular year is the decision of that individual, not of the city being directly indirectly. That's certainly an impact, but directly I can't tell you how much a renter's rent is going to change from one year to another.
But I would expect that if the property taxes were going up 6.5%, given rental property unfortunately is also a business, they're going to pass that cost along.
Mr. Chair.
Probably just like the franchise fee.
Sure. Mr. Chair, Councilmember Quincy, Councilmember Quincy, Councilmember Goodman, if the request is to create a chart of value changes, similar to this for rental property across the city, we will work with the city assessor and attempt to provide that information to you, if that's what I understand your request.
I think it would be interesting to see, especially for properties valued under 10 million. This seems to be the sweet spot of this naturally occurring affordable housing. And buildings that are worth 100 million, I'm not so worried about, but I am more, because that tends to be more luxury apartments, but these naturally occurring smaller buildings that have a value that are less, clearly their market value is increasing because they're being bid up by people who are coming in to buy them, replace the appliances, and then flip them. So I am interested in how property taxes are also compounding to owners, forcing them to raise rents.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Goodman, I understand completely. So with that, I'm moving off property taxes.
Before we do, Mr. Ruff, I think Councilmember Bender wanted to talk about that previous slide. Am I correct?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to follow up. How many total parcels are there in the city? Roughly, or I mean, I guess I just am kind of curious how accurate the sample is. And then, of course, all of us, especially as people get their bills and look more deeply into them, get a lot of questions about how the taxes are fluctuating. And in the past, I've been able to work with the assessor's office to get more details about things that impact my ward. Of course, every year I've asked about renters because 80% of my ward are renters. So that's been an ongoing conversation that many of us have had over the years. So I guess the question is, how do we get more detail about our own particular wards?
So I think, number one, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Bender, we are finishing up, and hopefully when we get some of the details from the county, we will have ward by ward breakdowns of value changes for each of the council members. So that will be information that will be shortly forthcoming. Second of all, within the definition of residential here are duplexes, triplexes. So again, renters are included in this chart. It is not just single family homestead properties. And there are, to answer your question, 131,217 residential parcels. So the sample size is the vast majority of those parcels. It's not just a 10% sampling or something like that. So I think this is largely reflective of that market. So apartments are a separate class and tend to be 4 or more units in one parcel, which is the definition, at least for property taxes, again, not necessarily related to the zoning code, but for property taxes, an apartment is 4 or more units in one parcel. So I think that's where Councilmember Gooden was talking about under 10 million. Those tend to be not then the several hundred unit buildings that are being built. It's more of the 30, 50 unit buildings that have been around since the 1950s, 40s, or 60s. Okay. Thank you for the clarification. Enterprise funds, I'm going to quickly walk through this unless there are some issues that you want to highlight. One is parking, important part of our enterprise. It does make transfers out to the general fund to help support both general fund activities and also the target center. Those are largely stay the same, slight increase for the target center transfer out. But again, continuing on capital improvements for this particular enterprise, as well as one of the higher debt service levels within our city as well. And so we are working hard to pay down as quickly as possible the debt service relating to the parking funds, but overall healthy, I think, compared to especially what has happened in the past. For the utilities and those monthly utility bills that are put
Mr. Ruff,
forward. Yes.
excuse me, just I saw Councilmember Fry. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On the previous slide, the parking fees that we're presently getting, I know we put several of our spaces in line with the market rate for the area, especially on event days lately. Is that approximately 7 million increase due to that, or is it an increased use, more spaces being filled? Do we know?
In terms of the, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Fry, in terms of the capital budget increases, the 7 million, or which increase are you referring to?
Well, we've got the operating revenue increases.
Okay. So, Councilmember Fry, I think I would say that my understanding from John Wirtjes, and certainly we can follow up with him and make sure he answers this in the presentation, is that what drives revenue here really are the parking meters, not the parking
That's what I was
rents.
assuming, right?
So, just a highlight of own personal experience when I went to a Minnesota United soccer game recently near the U of M, and the private parking lots were charging $15, and I went to one of the meters because I want to support the city, right? So I park in the meter, and they charged me $14.50. So that's event parking that they clearly are, because of their system, are able to keep up with what the current competition is, and so that is certainly driving increased revenues. And I would say activity generally downtown is also driving revenues for those metered spaces.
Got it. Thank you.
And in the case of parking, it also corresponds with a reduction in our fines and forfeitures because more people are paying for parking rather than getting tickets. So there's a kind of a wash in between about revenue gain versus through fines and forfeitures or through parking revenues.
Mr. Chair, you're absolutely right. And if you recall, a recognition of that was in the 17 budget. There was a substantial increase, if I remember, $3 million of that general fund transfer. It was either $2.5 or $3 million. It used to be $4.5 million. It went up to $7 million. But again, those debt service pressures on the parking fund are real, and so we want to make sure that we don't put them in a precarious situation. The increases here, I just want to highlight one of the things in terms of 9% increases on the surface water and storm water and sanitary sewer. Sanitary sewer is, remember, much of those expenditures are driven by the Met Council rather than the city itself. And the Met Council has been increasing expenditures. Surface water, in terms of storm water, we have some major capital improvements associated with that particular fund. But overall, I'm going to show you a chart that will just say what do those cost increases mean in terms of actually rate charges to the homeowners and businesses in town. This is just water itself in terms of not just the 2018, but also looking several years out in terms of rate increases that are forecast. And the water utilities, certainly you're all familiar with the improvements going on in Fridley in terms of the plant and the filtration replacement is an active area for the city right now. Sanitary sewer rates forecasted as well, and the Met Council has been better about helping us on sanitary sewer forecasting as well. So I think these incorporate at least 3 of the years incorporate anticipated increases with Met Council. Stormwater, it's a smaller dollar amount, but the rate increases are not matching what the percentage expenditure increases are. And again, that's because our capital expenditures tend to be more episodic. The rate helps even those increases out. So for what most people care about, which is what's the total amount, when we aggregate all these, it's 4.4%, or about $4.20 per month for the average residential customer. And lastly, in terms of the last few categories, special revenue funds, as I mentioned, we have shifted the accounting, but also that's not just an accounting shift of the sales taxes, it's also a management shift as well. So pursuant to that staff direction of last December, we've created a committee with the city coordinator, and that's myself, the CPED director, the Public Works director, and the Convention Center director to oversee 4 assets: the Convention Center, the Target Center, the Commons, and PV. And then creation of this new fund where all the sales tax come in. I know one of the issues that Councilmember Glidden has raised in the past is what exactly are we using our sales taxes for? And I think this new structure will give more definition as to where sales taxes are going in terms of the uses. But in addition to that general fund transfer that I mentioned earlier, we're continuing with what the primary sales tax uses have been, which is Convention Center and Target Center, but also $4 million in the mayor's proposed capital budget for PV Plaza one time, and then ongoing of $400,000, and then $750,000 one time for the Downtown Commons operating expenses. Target Center, just want to highlight that certainly compliments to our partners with the Timberwolves, and certainly Jeff Johnson, the Convention Center. That project has stayed on budget, and the Timberwolves stepped up with some additional funding, but we're all excited to see that renovated facility open in October. This year will be the first year of the debt service associated with that, and that again will be a part of this downtown assets fund of $5.7 million. And that acquisition, the original debt that will be soon ending, does not come out of the sales tax revenues. It comes out of the consolidated TIF district. I think the council's aware of that, but it's also helpful to remind people. Convention Center dollars are largely, good revenue increases. Certainly the Convention Center will benefit from the Super Bowl in 2018. We have that continued debt service on the Convention Center through 2020, and then you recall that we shift in 2021 to repaying the state and start paying debt service on the U.S. Bank Stadium. There is also change items associated with major events, both Minneapolis and the Convention Center, that are highlighted as well. Internal service funds, I will not bore you with the details other than to say they are healthy, and we are drawing down the cash out of some of those funds, as was part of the streets and parks. And then, as I mentioned, we have some cost containment just to keep the increases on those 2 particularly necessary functions of intergovernmental service fund, which is IT, and then the fleet fund. So lastly, capital. You can see the debt service obligations that I mentioned earlier. I will highlight that within this capital budget is not the downtown office building, as we've discussed with the council previously. We don't have the exact size and cost of that building. That'll be known later this year in a better scope when we come back to you in December. We're not issuing net debt bonds, so it's not really part of the CLIC process. But we are going to capitalize those capitalize those expenses associated with the project as we start to award bids in 2018, assuming that the council wants to move forward this fall. And we will issue bonds and have debt service paid when those library bonds I mentioned earlier, and when we get out of those other buildings that are saving us lease and operating cost expenses that are in today's budget. So we'll be back to you in December on that particular issue. This is overall from the recommended capital budget, the change from 17 to 18 in total funding, which includes our portion of this particular building, the NBC. Some major projects with funding in 2018 are highlighted here. You will hear more about that from Mr. Abelin in the Public Works Department, I'm sure. This chart contains a 5-year forecast in terms of the expenses, and you can see obviously Public Works is the vast majority of those capital expenses. And then Public Works is broken down by different categories. Certainly streets being the single largest expense out of that capital budget. Storm sewers and water being second. But certainly the pedestrian improvements I mentioned is while a small amount is increased from 17 and 18 as well. The bridges on the back end of that, you see a small amount and then a large number in 2022. I think that's largely related still to a couple of bridges, but the Nicollet Avenue Bridge over the creek is certainly a longer term concern for the city. Debt service, as I said, has been falling. As we see the 20-year streets and parks plan come forward and some of these other capital improvements, you will start to see that debt service, the outstanding amount of debt, not necessarily the debt service, but the outstanding amount of debt, which had been as high as almost $1.3 billion, is down to under $800 million. And the last thing is just our capital assets request system. So we have this competitive process where there is a limited amount of dollars available, but important dollars for those, especially those smaller departments who don't have the ability to absorb IT or small equipment needs. So for this particular year, of the $22.1 million, 6.9 is funded by the general fund, and the breakdown of where those dollars are proposed to be by department, and certainly within your book has more detail on that. Lastly, just a 5-year financial direction. It's always important to look ahead. In 2021, as that consolidated TIF district goes away, we anticipate a larger increase in the levy. That was part of the 20-year streets and parks increase. Streets and parks agreement. So that particular year is going to see a higher than normal property tax levy increase. But these are the dollars that are continuing within the 5-year financial forecast. Here's the schedule, Mr. Chair, that I think certainly your staff has been updating. But just want to highlight the BET public hearing on the 27th. That was continued. And the final approval of the maximum levy. And then also, I know, Mr. Chair, you want to probably highlight our new website that has been put forth by our city clerk and with cooperation with our department and the IT, and all of the information is detailed out on that website as well.
Good. Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Ruff, for the overview. I would indeed like to point out, I thought it was a terrific a website that's made it much easier to navigate for the public to understand the budgeting process, the budgeting basics, frequently asked questions. That website is available at budget.minneapolismn.gov. And it was a terrific undertaking by a number of departments, but certainly finance department, city clerk's office, communications, IT did a terrific job of putting that up very quickly. That includes the full budget as well as presentations. And under that part of the budget process has a special call out for the calendar of the events. And it does start with our budget hearing schedule, and that's available online. But the first one, it actually is on October 3rd at 9:30 in this chamber. And before that, as Mr. Ruff noted, the Board of Estimate and Taxation, who has the responsibility for setting the maximum levy amount. And that the public hearing from the first meeting was continued to the September 27th, where we will be passing the final maximum levy for the budget process. So those are the highlights on the process going forward, as well as the resources available to us all. I would encourage members, if you'd like to have specific questions raised as part of the department public hearing process, please include Mr. Intermill or Mr. Ruff, Ms. Johnson, on how we can best address those needs. We'd like those conversations to be as robust as possible. We'd like to talk about revenues as well as the expenditures, focusing in on the changes and some, as well as the staffing. That's one of the things I've been asking for in these reports is what's changing in our in the full-time or the number of full-time members of the team in each department. Is that going up or down? And then we can go into specific programs that the departments will be bringing forward, and as well as their continuing service levels that we'll be looking for some conversation about as well. And then we take up the process through the budget hearings to final determination after markup and ongoing debate at this, and we'll be passing a budget in December, and then we'll be able to move forward. So thank you very much for the overview. If there are any other questions on the process, on the content or how to get some more information? Not seeing any now. So thank you very much. I'd like to take an action on this. Normally, it would be just to receive and file and a thank you for your presentation, but this, we're going to have a special action for the committee to refer it to the budget committee, the sub-budget committee for further consideration. So all those in favor of the motion to refer to the budget committee, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That item carries. Thank you very much. That it concludes our agenda for today, and we are adjourned.